Good day. Today, 23rd July 2024, the transfer of power in the United States continues. It's strange to use that kind of language about the United States, a country which, of course, proclaims itself to be a constitutional republic. In fact, the first and preeminent constitutional republic. But I think transfer of power is just about the right word to describe what is happening. Those of us who once upon a time, long ago, well, in fact, not so long ago, used to follow the mechanisms of Soviet politics would have been very familiar with some of the language and events that are playing out in the United States at the moment. So the former leader, Joe Biden, still nominally in place, has now apparently delegated or formally delegated some of his powers to the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury. In person, of course, Tony Blinken and Janet Yellen. These powers will specifically concern the exercise of presidential authority to deal with the frozen assets, the Russian frozen assets, which are held in the United States. It's a small move. It's not one of the sort of core powers of the presidency, but it's the kind of thing which I think gives an impression that Joe Biden, though still nominally president, is increasingly becoming president in name only, and this move perhaps signals to the wider world and specifically to the US bureaucracy that the president, even while still in the Oval Office, still in the White House, is gradually giving away those powers that he has, and increasingly powers will be exercised on his behalf by the various officials. Again, as I said, those of us who are familiar with the way things are done too in various other places, will be very familiar with this kind of process, but it is strange to see it play out in this kind of way in the United States. And then, of course, we've had the coronation, well, not exactly coronation, but the unanimous display of support for his successor. To those of us who remember the old times, we can all remember, I think, how the Politburo used to present the new General Secretary, the person that they nominated as General Secretary, to the Central Committee, and we would receive shortly after confirmation that the Central Committee had elected this person unanimously. Well, something fairly similar appears to be playing out within the Democratic Party. Now, again, it's important to say that clearly behind the scenes, as by the way was also the case in selection of general secretaries in the former Soviet Union, doubts fester, uncertainties exist. The factions that are there are, of course, still there, and they're all maneuvering for position, even as all of them, to all appearances, unite around the designated appointee or successor. In this particular case, of course, the successor is Kamala Harris. She has now received the unanimous support of many of the donors, who apparently stomped up something like $85 million of financial assistance in the first couple of hours after her presumed appointment or anointing as presidential candidate in the election in November. She has also received the critical public backing of Nancy Pelosi, who is one of these powerful figures in the Democratic Party who no longer actually has, as far as I can see, any formal role any longer in the Democratic Party. She is still, of course, a representative in Congress, but she stepped down from the office of Speaker some time ago, and she no longer leads the Democrats officially in the House of Representatives, except, of course, it's increasingly clear, this time perhaps more like what you see in Japan than what you see in the United States. It's clear that she does. Just as in Japan, all sorts of elderly, retired leaders actually exercise vast sway behind the scenes amongst members of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, and in former times used to be the key decision makers. Well, something similar appears to be playing out with Nancy Pelosi in the United States, because, as I said, though she is nominally retired, she is still accepted as a party elder, and the result is that her decision to support Kamala Harris is widely seen as decisive. And today we got reports that the various delegates who had previously supported Joe Biden are in their thousands effortlessly transferring their loyalties from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris. Well, I sound perhaps a little cynical about this process, and I think cynicism is justified. There's been much comment, for example, in independent media especially, not, of course, the mainstream media, about the strange nature of the announcement which was made on Sunday. The fact that the announcement of the president's decision, Joe Biden's decision, not to seek the nomination of his party for the presidency, for the election to the presidency, how that was made in a statement written on a blank sheet of paper, but typed out, it would seem, with a signature that some people thought was, or think, looked canned in some way. I'm not sure what that means, by the way. But anyway, and that it wasn't written on the note paper either of the White House or of the Biden campaign, and that there were no presidential seals or anything of that kind. And again, people have noted the odd way in which 27 minutes after that statement was published on social media, a further social media post suddenly appeared announcing Joe Biden's support for Kamala Harris. As I said in my program yesterday, all of this points, in my opinion, to dissension, probable arm twisting and all kinds of things like that. I think it's a leap too far to think that it means that Joe Biden himself was not in agreement with the decisions that were made on Sunday, which I have seen some people suggest. I don't think that, though it is the case that so far he's been very quiet. He's not appearing visibly. He's not made any public statements. I read yesterday that he's now been working the phones, at least to some extent, trying to persuade delegates to support Kamala Harris. I wonder how many phone calls those were, by the way. But anyway, it's easy to be deeply cynical about this process. And as I said, I've described the strange, or at least unusual way by American standards that it is being carried out. But it's important to remember that there is an election coming in November, and it is absolutely essential for the Democrats, after the chaos and dissension of the last few weeks, to at least appear to be presenting a united front as they try to combine against the Republicans and Donald Trump. And as I said, if there is some elements of this drama which give the appearance of orchestration and all the rest. Well, given that imperative, this is not especially surprising. In fact, the fact that the Democrats are acting in this way, given the fact that they've just ousted their leader, well, one would hardly expect it to play out otherwise. Will this solve their underlying problems? To be frank, I don't think so. I think a lot of the questions people are asking are going to become even more prevalent. And I think that another event which took place yesterday is going to make these questions that many people are asking, both about this process, about Joe Biden's exact role in it, about Kamala Harris's policies, which, by the way, are completely unclear to me. I don't know what her foreign policy stances are going to be, for example, or who she's going to pick as her team if elected to the presidency, or if she becomes president before the election. There's lots of unanswered questions about Kamala Harris, which, as I said, have not been resolved. But anyway, there was another event that took place yesterday, which I think is going to deepen still further the cynicism of many people in the United States about the entire process. And that was an astonishing session in the relevant committee of the House of Representatives, in which the head of the Secret Service, Kimberly Cheetle, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, was asked all kinds of questions about the circumstances surrounding the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. And I have to say, it was one of the most abject performances I have ever seen. Kimberly Cheetle provided no real explanations of anything that happened. She showed an astonishing lack of understanding of the extent of the failure that took place. And incredibly, she still seems to be intent, despite the grotesque security failure that took place, to hold on to her post as director of the Secret Service. Now, I wonder whether she would have been taking the same stance if the assassination attempt had succeeded. And bear in mind, we are talking about an assassination attempt which came exceptionally close to doing so, because, well, she didn't seem to recognize that there were any real problems with the way things had happened, and she didn't seem to be particularly keen on answering any questions, and she certainly didn't seem to be keen on presenting her resignation or anything like that. And, well, there were some really astonishing revelations, like the fact that there was apparently no record kept of any of the communications that took place around the between the Secret Service and the various other agencies at the time of the incident. Apparently, the communications were not preserved, making the investigation very difficult. By the way, contradicting, as I seem to remember, what happened following the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. To my recollection, many of the communications were indeed preserved at that time. Anyway, there we go. So there wasn't much of that. She seemed unclear whether the building where the shooter, the would-be assassin, positioned himself. She seemed unclear whether it was within the security zone or not. She seemed very uncertain as to who exactly was there amongst the Secret Service. And of course, we have had, previous to this extraordinary session in Congress, a session, by the way, in which Democrats seem to be as infuriated by Kimberly Cheatle's inability to answer questions as some Republicans were. Anyway, before this session, we were also getting finally confirmation that the Trump campaign had indeed requested enhanced security for Donald Trump from the Secret Service. There have been many reports that this was indeed the case. The Secret Service has consistently, up to now, denied that these requests were made or that they had been refused, except we now know that, in fact, the requests were indeed made and apparently they were refused. So if you want to engage in all kinds of theories about that event, I'm afraid Kimberly Cheatle's extraordinary performance and her incredible decision to remain in position, in place, well, that's going to feed all of those people who have their theories, which I suspect now are going to proliferate. And yes, I do accept that these are two different incidents. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump and the decision of the president to stand down from the election. But of course, they are different incidents, but they are nonetheless connected incidents. And it's going to be very difficult to prevent the cynicism about the one from leading to increased cynicism about the other. Anyway, the Democrats have much to do, and they need to sort themselves out before the convention. I noticed that though Nancy Pelosi has now come out and weighed in support of Kamala Harris, Barack Obama still has not done so, even though he is the person that many assume was the prime plotter in the events that led to Joe Biden's decision to step down. Now, whether there is going to be this presidential address from Joe Biden, which we have been promised for this week, in which the president is going to provide more clarity about the reasons for his decision to step down, we will have to see. The statement that was published on Sunday promised it, but since then, there's been nothing further heard about it. In fact, we've heard and seen virtually nothing from the president himself at all. Now, it's important to remember that the president is a human being. He's probably deeply upset about the events that have taken place. It's understandable that he feels the need for some privacy in the aftermath of those events on Sunday. But he is still the President of the United States. The American people still deserve a proper explanation from their president about what took place over the weekend. And I earnestly hope that we do get that presidential address this week. And if not this week, then very soon, also to provide some clarity and explanation about these extraordinary events that are playing out. Now, there is, it must be said also, a view from various media journalists and commentators that Kamala Harris's emergence as the Democratic Party's candidate in the election in November is going to change the complete electoral dynamics. That might turn out to be the case, but I see no sign of that at the moment. And the more opaque this process is and continues to be, the more difficult I think it will be for the Democrats to come up with a convincing narrative that will be persuasive to many millions of Americans in the election which is coming. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this affair. There's an awful lot that could be said. There's an awful lot that many people are saying, though it's important to say that much of that appears to me, for the moment, to be pure guesswork. But the Democrats, as I said, are trying to present a united front. They're trying to put everything together, all the pieces of Humpty Dumpty, who's had his great fall. They're rushing to put it all together again and to present a united front in advance of the election. That, as I said, is part of what they need to do, but they also, it seems to me, need to provide some explanations as to what happens, and ultimately, and coming back to the point I made in my program yesterday, they also need to address the continued issue of Joe Biden's continued incumbency. The fact that even though he's now pulled out from the presidential race, he remains president and is still in the White House, despite the fact that he now appears to be taking the first tentative steps to divest himself of some of his powers. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this matter, about the actual transfer of power. I am going to say one further thing, however, and that is that whoever the Democratic Party's candidate is for the forthcoming election, they're going to have to form very quickly views and try to put together policies to deal with the two big crises that are looming over the horizon in foreign policy terms. One is the tragedy and disaster that continues to play out in the Middle East. Tomorrow, Benjamin Netanyahu arrives in the United States. He's going to address Congress. He's been invited to do so by Speaker Johnson. So we're going to have Netanyahu in the United States. His position looks more secure now than it has done at any point, in my opinion, since the events of 7th October 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel. He has seen off Joe Biden. He commands a stable and united government. The war cabinet has been dissolved, but the government that remains in place is more coherent and arguably more loyal to himself. And of course, he shows absolutely no sign of seriously wanting a ceasefire in Gaza. And he has in fact been taking various steps to escalate the ongoing situation in the Middle East, as one might expect of him. So, a couple of days ago, a drone from Yemen launched by the Houthis reached Tel Aviv and apparently killed an Israeli civilian, which is embarrassing and tragic. But Prime Minister Netanyahu, now in full control of the government of Israel, having, as I said, seen off Joe Biden and all the pressure that Joe Biden was trying to put on him to agree to a ceasefire. I think that's buried, by the way. And also having almost certainly seen off the rather weak attempts orchestrated by the Biden administration to try to get Netanyahu to step down or be ousted as Prime Minister of Israel. Well, Netanyahu, stronger than ever, has ordered, in response to this drone attack, an airstrike on a port in Yemen. And there have been lots of pictures of that airstrike. The Houthis, predictably, have promised retaliation. So war is coming to the Middle East. Of course, it's never ended. The fighting in Gaza has been continuing, but it looks as if the war in the Middle East is intensifying again and spreading. And, well, the Israeli government has talked at various times about launching an operation against the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon. So far, they haven't yet launched a full-scale ground and air offensive against Hezbollah. I suspect that the major factor holding them back from doing it is the unwillingness of the Israeli military to do it, rather than any political pressures from the United States. But who knows, maybe now that Netanyahu is coming to the United States, his political position in Israel itself looks secure, and his political position in the United States as well is now looking stronger and more stable than it has done. Anyway, perhaps now that Mr. Netanyahu is again in the ascendant, that operation against Hezbollah will at some point be launched over the course of the next few weeks. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu this is reflecting the change in the wind, the political wind, the fact that he is now clearly in the ascendant, even as Biden himself fades from the scene. Anyway, he's now had verbal support from none other than Tony Blinken about Iran. Iran, Tony Blinken tells us, is now within a week or 2 weeks away from accumulating enough enriched uranium to build some kind of nuclear device. Whether this is actually the case or not, I can't say. It may be true, but in fact, as I understand it, US intelligence continues to say that Iran is showing no signs so far of developing a nuclear weapons capability. But Tony Blinken coming forward and making this comment on the eve of the visit to the United States of a triumphant Benjamin Netanyahu, well, that, of course, is going to be music to Netanyahu's ears. Netanyahu now has something that he can take to Congress. He can say that the Secretary of State, no less, has confirmed that Iran is indeed heading purposefully towards acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, and there are going to be plenty of people in Congress who are going to listen and applaud that, and who will express their support for the hard line that Prime Minister Netanyahu predictably will want to take towards Iran. And adding even further to the sense of Netanyahu being in the ascendant, and the Democratic Party and the current administration being in eclipse, it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu intends to have a meeting with his old friend Donald Trump. Donald Trump has made some criticisms of Israeli policy recently, but it's clear that with the election coming, Prime Minister Netanyahu is starting to think of Donald Trump as the next likely president of the United States, and the two men are probably going to work towards achieving some sort of understanding with each other. I've made the point in previous programs that the one thing that the international system abhors most of all is the appearance of a vacuum of power in the United States. They will all be anxious that it be filled as soon as possible. In the case of the great majority of countries around the world, pretty much all of them outside Europe, they will now be quietly hoping that there is a conclusive victory for Donald Trump in the elections in November, because he looks far and away the most plausible successor and the most likely person to restore some sense of coherence and authority to the US government. I've said that Israel would be one of those countries that thought in that way. And I also said that various leaders would now be, around the world, would now be sending their emissaries or their functionaries or even themselves beating towards Donald Trump's door. And we see that Benjamin Netanyahu, as one might have expected, is the first one. Talking about Netanyahu being in the ascendant, it's perhaps also worth pointing out that things are also looking up for him in the International Criminal Court. The ICC, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, as all of us remember, applied for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his defense minister, Mr. Gallant. The ICC has slow-walked that request, perhaps unsurprisingly, and the British and German governments have now joined the case and are apparently insisting that the ICC revisit the question of whether it has jurisdiction over Israel to issue these warrants, which is a signal that they want the warrants to be cancelled. We'll see what the ICC does eventually do, but for the moment at least, Netanyahu has every reason to think that things are going his way. Anyway, suffice to say that Kamala Harris, if she becomes the nominee for the Democratic Party, which she inevitably will soon be, and once she is in a position to start making decisions and to formulate policy, needs to think very hard about the situation in the Middle East and needs to think very hard about how she's going to resolve the problem in the Middle East in a way that will finally appease the great anger that there is amongst many people in the Democratic Party's base over the Biden administration's support for the Netanyahu government. And with Prime Minister Netanyahu in the ascendant, that might prove a difficult thing to do. However, an even bigger crisis looms directly over the horizon, and that, of course, is the war in Ukraine. Now, I have been saying in program after program, basically since around March, that the situation in Ukraine, for Ukraine, is deteriorating fast. And it's now starting to, this fact is now starting to reach the mainstream media as well. Yesterday, for the first time, we had reports in Reuters. Interesting that a lot of these reports are coming from Reuters, which is a British news agency, Britain's premier news agency. But anyway, Reuters is finally admitting the crisis, or at least acknowledging the existence of a crisis for Ukraine in the Ocheretino, Avdiivka, Pokrovsk area. It says that there's an article that appeared, Russian troops mount pressure on Ukrainian logistics hub of Pokrovsk, and Ukraine's top commander, that's to say General Syrsky, said on Monday that Russian forces were staging relentless assaults to try to advance towards Pokrovsk, a logistics hub in the east, and that there was active fighting taking place along the entire front line. Nearly 29 months since the full-scale invasion, Ukraine has stepped up its mobilization efforts to address the manpower shortage and been reinforced by supplies of Western artillery shells. But Russian troops have continued to inch forward. Inch forward is not what I would call it, by the way. The Russians are generally advancing in most places along the front line by 1 or 2 or sometimes a bit more kilometers a day. May not sound very dramatic, but given that we're talking about pushing through fortified positions and given the scale of Ukrainian losses, it is actually very significant progress. But anyway, and then there is a quotation from General Syrsky: the enemy pays no attention to their fairly high level of losses and continues to push through towards Pokrovsk, which is, by the way, Syrsky's way of admitting that the Russians are breaking through to Pokrovsk. And then we're told Pokrovsk is less than 25 kilometers, 15 miles from Russian-occupied land, according to open source intelligence battlefields, which is an elegant way of acknowledging that the village of Progress has now fallen under Russian control without actually naming the village, and lies at an intersection of roads and a railway that makes it an important logistics point for the military and for civilians in the east. And that is, as I said, the first admission I've seen anywhere in the Western media that the situation is, in fact, becoming increasingly critical for Ukraine in the Pokrovsk area. On the subject of Syrsky, he said that active combat operations of varying intensity are taking place along the entire front. Russians are also trying to capture floodplain islands near the southern Ukrainian city of Kherson. I haven't discussed this, but over the last few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, the Russians have been gradually reoccupying the various islands in the Dnieper River. During the Krinky operation, which has now, even Ukrainian commentators admit, has failed and has collapsed. During the Krinky operation, the Ukrainians occupied several of these islands. Now it is the Russians who are reoccupying them. That is bringing them very close to the west bank of the Dnieper River and including Kherson city. There is rumors and speculations that the Russians are preparing some kind of cross-river operation, that they're going to return to the west bank, perhaps even reoccupy Kherson city itself. I have absolutely no idea one way or the other about this. It is the case that some months ago, film appeared of Russian troops in Russian-controlled Kherson region rehearsing river crossing operations. So maybe that is indeed the plan. But anyway, the point is that Syrsky is clearly worried about the fact that the Russians are reoccupying these islands in the Dnieper, though it is not at all clear what he intends to do. Then Reuters continues. Fierce battles, Syrsky said, also raged near several eastern villages and towns, including Krasnogorovka and Chasiv Yar, a strategic hilltop town whose capture would bring Russia closer to threatening important Kiev-held Donetsk region cities. And we go on to read, though, Kiev's weary troops have been on the back foot this year, with Russia again on the offensive and keeping up the pressure. Moscow's progress has been slow, which, as I said, I don't actually agree with that view at all. But anyway, there we go. So that's Reuters finally acknowledging that the Russians are making progress. They're now within 15 miles of Pokrovsk. That, by the way, represents significant progress. If you go to a map and look at where the Russians were, say in January, before the fall of Avdiivka, you can see the extent of the Russian advance, and the fact that they're now close to Pokrovsk marks a significant change in the direction of the battle. Now, Syrsky also had other things to say as well, by the way. One of them, well, it almost echoed a comment that I made, I think, in my program yesterday. I said that I was puzzled at the continued obsession with supplying Patriot missiles to Ukraine, given that these missiles are in short supply, that the Russians have shown repeatedly that they have the ability to destroy these missiles and their launchers, and that their cruise missiles are able to get through, and that the Patriots cannot counter Russia's hypersonic missiles, but also given that these are large, very expensive missiles, and that if one looks at the Russian air defense system, one gets the sense that the bulk of missile interceptions, the bulk of the interceptions of Ukrainian missiles and drones that take place are not carried out by the expensive S-400s and S-300s, but by the much cheaper, much more readily available shorter range missiles, the Pantsir, the Tor, the Strela 10, and systems like that. Well, Syrsky made exactly the same point yesterday. He complained that Ukraine is desperately short of short-range missiles. He specifically talked about manpads, systems, in other words, like the Strela 10 and the Igla and all of those which the Russians have in abundance. These are the systems that Ukraine needs more than any others to deal with drones, especially the Russian surveillance drones, which are now dominant across the battlefronts and which enable the Russians to keep constant track of pretty much everything that the Ukrainians are doing. Well, famously, US production of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, manpads, ended some time ago. The United States is trying to restart the production lines for the Stingers. Some of the old technicians who used to make them, they're being chased out of requirement. No doubt more Stingers will be produced. No doubt some of them will be sent to Ukraine. But given the underlying shortages, it seems very difficult to believe that the Americans or their European allies will be able to provide the Ukrainians with anything like the number of manpads they need to counter the problem posed by these increasing numbers of Russian surveillance drones. Anyway, there we go. That's Syrsky, that's Reuters. What is actually happening on the battlefronts? Well, we got more news over the last 24 hours. And we also had, at the start, a very dramatic announcement from the Russian Defense Ministry. And it said this: Iskander-M operational tactical missile system delivered a strike at a temporary deployment area of instructors and mercenaries from Western countries. Full stop. And then there's a film of the attack, and the location is identified as a small town or village in Kharkiv region called Dergachi. And then the Russian Defense Ministry says, as a result, up to 50 foreign instructors were eliminated. Eliminated, presumably killed or wounded. Now, the key word there is instructors. Instructors is not the same as combat mercenaries. They are people who have been sent by the Western countries to undertake training for the Ukrainian armed forces. And the Russians claim that up to 50 of them were killed or wounded in this missile strike. There has been no confirmation of this from any Western government. But if it's true, then this is a devastating loss of Western personnel. I've seen rumours, and I want to stress again, they are only rumours and they seem to be coming entirely from Russian sources, so they need to be taken, this information needs to be taken with a great deal of skepticism. But anyway, I've seen rumours that at least 18 of these instructors were British and that they might have included officers. Is this true? Is this not? I have absolutely no idea, but the Russian Defense Ministry report is there. It says that a missile strike using Iskander-M missiles was delivered against a temporary deployment area of instructors and mercenaries from Western countries. We're not told how many mercenaries were killed, but we're told that up to 50 foreign instructors were eliminated, which could mean dead or wounded. So that's, on the face of it, a pretty devastating blow. And if there is any truth to this report, and I suspect that there is at least some truth to this report, but if there is any truth to this report, and of course, if it is entirely true, which it might be, again, I'm not saying that it isn't, well, that is going to ring major alarm bells in Western countries, especially the countries whose instructors were killed or wounded in this attack. So anyway, that's one report that we've had from the Russians. There's also reports of a similar missile strike on some kind of facility in Odessa, with claims that instructors were killed there as well. But I will say straight away that I have not yet seen the details of this. The Russian Defense Ministry then published its account of the fighting yesterday, and over the course of it, by the way, and incidentally, it confirmed that the village of Ivano-Darievka in the area near Syrsky has indeed been captured. Of course, this was reported a couple of days ago. So there we go. But anyway, that's fairly dramatic news from the Russian Defense Ministry. But others have provided us with a lot more news, and this is where we go back to the various reporters, war reporters, mapping projects, all of those, and they provided us with a great deal of information about the state of the battle. This doesn't come with quite the authority that one would get from a statement by the Russian Defense Ministry, but nonetheless, it is all very interesting, and most of it almost certainly is true. Firstly, reports that the Russians are indeed enlarging the area that they control around the bridgehead that they've achieved, or rather this area that they've captured, cutting the road between Konstantinovka and the fortress town of Vuhledar. We've not heard more reports about Russian advances west of this road towards Vodanye, the village there, but certainly the Russians seem to be consolidating their positions, and they don't seem to be encountering much in the way of resistance as they do so. Then, going a bit further north, there's been a lot of film and pictures now of Russian troops in the village of Maximilianovka, which is a village located directly east of Kurakhovo. It lies on a line, Maximilianovka, going from west to east. Kurakhovo, Maximilianovka, Georgievka, Marinka. Marinka, of course, was captured by the Russians. A small town was captured by the Russians in December. Georgievka was the village immediately to the west. The Russians captured Georgievka some weeks ago. There were reports that the Russians had entered Maximilianovka. The next village on the way to Kurachovo. There are now pictures of Russian troops in the center of Maximilianovka. The Russians control perhaps a third of this village. They seem to be pushing westwards. It's likely, it's a reasonable guess, that they will have reached the western boundary of Maximilianovka within perhaps a fortnight, at which point the distance between advanced Russian positions and Kurachovo will be reduced to something like 11 kilometers, so I understand. So, steady progress by the Russians there. More reports now, in fact, reports coming increasingly from the Ukrainians about the situation in Krasnogorovka. Note that Krasnogorovka was one of the places that Syrsky discussed in this report that's been talked about by Reuters. Anyway, more reports that the Russians are now fairly rapidly clearing what's left of the main part of Krasnogorovka, the area that I thought represented the entirety of Krasnogorovka, apart from this, as I say, westward spur of the town that I only realised existed a short time ago. Well, it is that the Russians are rapidly clearing that, and some days ago, apparently, I haven't heard it or seen transcripts of it, but apparently some days ago there was a recording published of a conversation between two Ukrainian officers. One was an officer based in Krasnogorovka. The other was this officer's senior commander, a more senior commander located presumably outside Krasnogorovka itself. Anyway, the officer in Krasnogorovka was asking for permission to retreat, saying that the situation had become unbearable, that the Russians were advancing, and the senior Ukrainian commander told him that if he did retreat, then the senior Ukrainian commander would himself come to the area and would himself execute the officer who was asking for permission to retreat. And the officer on this call, who was threatened in this way, was apparently so angry about it that he has arranged for this particular recording of this conversation to be released. Now, again, some are treating this as proof of the ruthlessness with which the Ukrainian army conducts operations. I would point out that historically, it's not hardly unprecedented for armies to act with brutal ferocity against soldiers who show unwillingness to fight in the face of the enemy. But the whole incident perhaps does again further illustrate the growing problems of morale within the Ukrainian armed forces. The fact that this conversation not only took place, but that it was made public, is indicative that things are not going at all well. Anyway, if one looks at the map, as I've discussed already, the fall of Krasnogorovka will open another route for an attack towards Kurachovo from the north, even as the Russians are pressing towards Kurachovo from the east through the village of Maximilianovka further south. Anyway, that's all dramatic news in itself. Even more dramatic news, however, is now coming from what I will increasingly call the Pokrovsk direction. There's reports that the Russians have now advanced westwards from the village of Progress, and also that they have now advanced northwards from the village of Lozovatska that they captured a couple of days ago, and that they're now attacking another village called Timofivka, which lies to the northwest of Lozovatska, and to the north, to the west of Novo-Alexandrovka, which of course they also captured a couple of weeks ago. And again, one can see the purpose of all of this. Timofeevka opens another route for an attack towards Vozhizhenka, where the Russians allegedly now stationed close to Vozhizhenka. And of course, once Vozhizhenka is captured, the Russians are able to cut the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar further east. It's very typical of the very methodical way in which the Russians conduct operations. They don't send big armoured forces hurtling towards Pokrovsk. They work methodically to take one village after another, leading up to Pokrovsk itself, capturing the roads. If they capture Timofeevka, then, as I said, other villages start to become more vulnerable in this area. They can take villages like Vozhizhenka, Yelizavetivka, Mirolyubivka, and then that will then bring them close to Mirnograd, Mirnograd being a large suburb immediately to the east of Pokrovsk, and then of course to Pokrovsk itself. And if we're talking about progress, they're also able to move directly along the TO 511 road, which passes through Progress, and there's various other small villages along the way, of which the most important is, of course, is a village called Grodivka. Once they've taken Grodivka, again, they're at the gateway of Mirnograd and indeed of Pokrovsk. So you can see that the Russian strategy is methodical, it's painstaking, it's risk-averse. It doesn't seek to absorb large numbers of casualties. But, as Syrsky said, it is relentless and it is unstoppable. And, well, very bad situation in the Pokrovsk area. But perhaps the most dramatic news over the last couple of hours continues to be the news in Toretsk. Here, it looks as if situation is deteriorating very fast. I discussed yesterday how there were lots of reports that 2 battalions of Ukrainian troops had become trapped in the area immediately to the east of the village of New York in the Toretsk area, and it looks as if the Russians have not only captured more territory in New York, but that they are in the process also of capturing more territory further north towards another important village or suburb, if you prefer, called Druzhba, which is also located in this same area. So, as I said, very intense fighting going on in the Pokrovsk area. The area known as Pishinya, Pivnichnya, has now apparently fallen, completely under Russian control. Druzhba, apparently another village also, or suburb of Toretsk, coming under attack, and signs that the Russians are pushing south from Pivnichny towards Zalizny, and a kind of micro cauldron involving these 2 battalions is starting to form, and there is, it seems, little this time that the Ukrainians can do to prevent it. Now, there were reports yesterday of a Ukrainian counterattack in the New York area. It appears to have been unsuccessful, but over the course of it, it became clear that even larger areas of New York, Novgorodsky, as I believe the Russians call it, have fallen under Russian control. From what I can see, the Russians now control around 60 to 70% of this village. So, situation in Toretsk going from bad to worse. Radio Liberty, by the way, has provided a photographic study showing Ukrainian troops trying to defend themselves in Toretsk. It provides very little actual information about how the battle itself is going. But it says, night moves in Toretsk, Ukraine's 95th Brigade holds the line against relentless Russian assaults. Notice again the use of the word relentless, and it's photography provided by Marian Kushnir, and we see pictures of resolute-looking Ukrainian soldiers, looking, however, also, I should say, a bit tired, but then they are in battle, after all, trying to hold back the Russians, who are, in fact, advancing and advancing relentlessly. And there is pictures of parts of the city of Toretsk itself looking demolished and burnt out, increasingly like husks. The buildings are becoming husks as the Russians, as I said, continue to advance relentlessly westwards. So anyway, that's the situation at the moment in Toretsk. Russian advances, no ability of the Ukrainians to hold them back. Less information yesterday about the situation in Chasiv Yar, where the Russians, by most reports, are now located in the center of the city, west of the aqueduct, but are also advancing north along the east bank of the aqueduct towards the village of Grigorivka, which is in low ground and which they're likely to capture without too much difficulty when they reach it. With the Russians likely to push on further north in that direction also, which would again put them within artillery range of both Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. But there was some fairly interesting, dramatic news in the Kupiansk area, where the Russians have recently managed to capture a string of villages. There's been reports from the Russians now about the situation in Makeyevka. The Russian news agency TASS has provided us with an account from our old friend Andrei Marochko about the situation in Makeyevka, village on the Oskol River, or the Zherebets River. He says, during the liberation of the Lugansk People's Republic, our troops inflicted a heavy fire defeat on the enemy in Makeyevka. The Ukrainian forces, having suffered significant losses, left their long-occupied firing positions and retreated to reserve positions northwest of the settlement. Now that's an indirect confirmation, as far as I can see, that certainly the area of Makeyevka, east of the Zherebets River, on the east bank of the Zherebets River, has indeed been captured by the Russians. The Ukrainians have retreated to reserve positions northwest of the settlement. He doesn't say that they've crossed the Zherebets River and positioned themselves there, but if you look at a map of Makeyevka, it looks likely. And it could be that the Russians have indeed crossed the river, as some reports say, and that they're now fighting in the western section of Makeyevka, on the west bank of the Zherebets River. And Marochko perhaps hinted at this. He says that Russian servicemen continue to fight for the liberation of Makeyevka, which, given that the Ukrainians have pulled out to the positions on the northwest of the settlement, that suggests, as I said, that the Russians have indeed crossed the river. It's all very elliptical, and maybe we're jumping to too many conclusions based on what Marochko says. But anyway, the Russians do seem to be well on the way either to capturing Mercouris completely, or at least to pushing the Ukrainians to the other side of the Deteriorates river. Now, the point is that the fall of Mercouris, the capture of various other villages in the general area of the Oskol and Deteriorates rivers, strengthens Russian positions in the northern part of Donbass. It puts them in a position where they can advance towards Liman and recapture Liman, which they lost in the autumn of 2022, which would put them within close distance of Slavyansk, the northern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. But it also potentially opens the way for an attack from the south towards Kupiansk, which lies further north, directly north of Mercouris. Now, there was a report yesterday that the village of Sinkovka, which has been bitterly fought over by the Russians and the Ukrainians, which lies immediately to the east of Kupiansk, that Sinkovka had fallen completely under Russian control. There have been many, many reports of that kind. Sinkovka has many times been reported as having been captured by the Russians. All of those reports, up to now, have turned out to be untrue. But yesterday there was another report that Sinkovka had indeed been captured by the Russians. I believe that yet again that report has been retracted. It's been suggested that Sinkovka is still mostly under Ukrainian control, but that the Russians are again attempting to storm the village. And they're doing so, of course, even as their forces are gathering south of Kupiansk, having captured these other locations further to the south. And lastly, in the Volchansk area, there are growing numbers of reports that the high-rise buildings area, the citadel area in northern Volchansk, has indeed fallen, and that the Russians are in complete control of it, and that the Russians are now successfully pushing the Ukrainians out of northern Volchansk, even as they have established themselves south of the Volcha River. So a very bad situation for the Ukrainians. Even Syrsky himself is admitting as much. And that brings us back to the question of what is Kamala Harris, as she will be the person who is the nominee, soon going to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. What is she going to do? What are her policies going to be about the situation in Ukraine? Now, given the extent of the deterioration of Ukraine's situation, it may not be possible to do what I think could be Kamala's instinct to do, which is to sit back and to let events in Ukraine take their course and to leave President Biden and his existing team to handle the situation, because it's unlikely that there will be anything dramatic happening in Ukraine before the election and before the inauguration in January. On the contrary, it could be that the deterioration will happen much more quickly than that, and that we could be faced, or at least the United States, the Western powers could be faced with a major crisis in Ukraine at some point, maybe in the late summer or early autumn, with the Russians in a position to start attacking major cities like Pokrovsk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Kupiansk, conceivably even Kharkiv itself. And of course, if the Russians do cross the river into Kherson region, well, that will be another crisis again of an even greater even greater crisis, and one which will pose its whole further set of challenges. Now, I said in my program yesterday that there are already people in the United States. There are already signs that there are people who want to take an even more belligerent line and who will be looking to President Biden to take an even more belligerent line towards Russia and Ukraine over the next few weeks, now that he's no longer a candidate for the presidency. And entirely unsurprisingly, these voices are starting to surface. So, for example, in the London Times, the former British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, is now advocating for President Biden to authorize Ukraine to undertake deep strikes with ATACMS missiles inside pre-2014 Russian territory. The very thing that the Russians have said is a red line, and which the United States government up to this point has said that it would not do. And there's been more reports, by the way, that from people like Charles Moore in The Telegraph, he rather, I think, absurdly appears to believe that the Russians, the Trump team might now harden its position against Russia, given that Biden is stepping down. I can't see the logic of that at all. But he also clearly is advocating for an even stronger line against the Russians over the next few weeks and months, now that President Biden has stepped down. These sort of comments and demands from people of a neocon point of view, I think that Kamala Harris needs to think very clearly and carefully about her position going forward. If she goes into the election in November as the war candidate, supporting the war in the Middle East, supporting the war in Ukraine, if she gives the impression that she's going to continue this utterly sterile and hopeless policy that the Biden administration has attached itself to, of supporting Ukraine for, as they say, as long as it takes, well, she materially very greatly increases the prospects that she will not only lose, but lose disastrously. Over the Middle East, she's taken, it seems to me, the first tentative step, perhaps, to try to distance herself from Prime Minister Netanyahu. She's apparently not going to attend herself the meeting in Congress which Netanyahu is going to address. She probably understands that pictures of herself applauding Netanyahu will not play well with the younger voters. She needs to win if she's going to have any prospect of winning the election in November. But over Ukraine, the dangers, the risks are very much greater. If, as Ukraine goes down, there is an escalation by the Biden White House trying to reverse the situation, missile strikes deep inside Russia, more deployments of American troops or special forces close to Ukraine, or even, God help us, in Ukraine itself, more signs that the situation there is getting out of control. Or alternatively, if the United States and the Biden administration lets events take its course, meaning that by the time of the November election, it looks visibly as if Ukraine is going down. Well, either way, Kamala Harris is taking on very significant political risks if she is seen to be identified with the president's hardline policy towards Ukraine. She could find herself, in effect, in the same position as the Democrats' vice president in the 1968 presidential election, Hubert Humphrey, who, after Lyndon Johnson pulled out of the presidential race, became the candidate for the Democratic Party, but found that he was not supported by large sections of the American people because he was identified with Lyndon Johnson's policy over the war, continuing the war in Vietnam. So I think Kamala Harris needs to learn that lesson and needs to start urgently looking for ways to distance herself from the Biden administration's current policy. I don't know whether she understands this. I don't know whether she has the political weight or authority to start to distance herself from the president, from the Biden administration, from the neocons over the policy in Ukraine. But if she doesn't, if she goes into the election as the supporter of Project Ukraine, even as Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are positioning themselves as the peace candidates, then I think that she stands a very, very real chance of not only losing the election, but of losing it very badly indeed. Well, I doubt that Kamala Harris will listen to my advice. I doubt that she is even aware of my advice. But for what it's worth, I'm giving it. The president choosing to step down from the election, in theory, ought to offer an opportunity to the president's party, to Kamala Harris specifically, to try to navigate a change of course over Project Ukraine. Options to do so exist, opportunities to do so exist. The Russians have not ruled out the possibility of negotiations. But will they be taken? I fear not. Anyway, we shall see what happens. I expect that I will be able to put behind me, for the time being at least, in my next program, the whole issue of the Biden, Kamala Harris, Democratic Party business. More likely we'll be able to return in my next program to the politics, the geopolitics of the rest of the world, and specifically what's going on in Ukraine itself. But anyway, there it is. This is where I end my program today. More from me soon. You can find again, of course, all our programs, including this program, on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. Don't forget too to check out our shop, where there are all the amazing things that you will find there: hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, magic mugs, all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.